Hello everyone, and welcome to the Obermann Get It Done workshop, Beyond Point with PowerPoint with Professor Jeremy Swanston. My name is Lauren Burrell-Cox, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies. The Obermann Center supports research work at the University of Iowa for faculty, staff, and students. This lunchtime workshop series is designed to help faculty, staff, and students learn specific skills to get things done. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Professor Jeremy Swanston is a graphic designer and scholar who has worked professionally for nearly 2 decades. During this time, he has developed extensive print and digital skills to meet the design needs of diverse clients, including the United States Congress and the Department of Justice. After receiving his MFA in graphic design in 2015, Swanston pursued a career in academia and is currently an assistant professor of graphic design and program head at the University of Iowa. His research, grounded on the principles of both human-centered and socially conscious design, focuses on the strategic use of graphic design processes and methods to affect positive social outcomes. Professor Swanston will give his presentation, and then we'll have time for Q&A. You can either put questions in the chat, or you can also use the raise hand function, and I'll call on you and you can unmute. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Swanston. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you to the Obermann Center for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you to all of you for joining us over the noon hour. So, like Lauren said, my name is Jeremy. I'm a professor in graphic design at the School of Art and Art History. I've been a graphic designer for just over 2 decades, so the time is catching up with me there. But during that time, I have worked on various print production materials, branding initiatives, and interaction design, so mobile app development as well as websites, a lot of those. So I'm excited to bring that expertise here and how we can bring that into PowerPoint designs. And so when I think of PowerPoints, I sort of would break it into 2 halves. One half is certainly the content and how we lay out that content, we organize it, how we're utilizing typography, imagery, and color to give it a unique look, a holistic look, right, that we can then present to the audience. And then the other side of that is sort of public speaking, right, how we as presenters even communicate with an audience. So that sort of half I'm still working on. I don't want to pretend like I'm going to give you the best advice of being a public speaker, but I can certainly talk to the graphic side of things, and that's what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to break it down into 3 categories. First, we'll start with type and image, and I sort of merge these 2 things together. Certainly in the classroom here at the School of Art and Art History, we do want our design students to be thinking about how they can bring both typography and imagery together to communicate a specific message to a large audience. And we want to do it in a way that is more simplified and intuitive. We'll then segue over into color, how we think about color, color theory, and then how you can start to leverage different color combinations, maybe for your PowerPoints. And then I want to touch upon very briefly at the end of this about storytelling and how in the design sphere, we're sort of thinking about how we can leverage storytelling techniques, narrative techniques within the design practice to better communicate and more effectively and engaging communicate with an audience. So I feel like all of those are going to segue really well into PowerPoint because they're doing a lot of similar things. So we'll start with typography. Typography really is an art form, and it's very, very, very complex. Typography, as we've known it now with printing presses and all that, has really been around since almost 1500 when Gutenberg invented the press, the very first press. And then we have the emergence of movable type. And from that, we have the explosion of different typefaces that have been constantly developed and innovated upon over the years and have changed their purposes. So we're going to scratch the surface, but I think once we get through these next few slides about typography, hopefully you feel comfortable in terms of some best practices and approaches that you can leverage and utilize for your presentations. So the first and foremost crucial thing about typography is that it has to be legible, has to be readable. Otherwise, whatever you're trying to communicate to an audience gets lost. So I tell my students priority number 1 has to be the legibility and for people to actually see what it is you're trying to communicate. whether it's in print or on the screen. And so I would say definitely utilizing legible fonts, right? If we think about sort of the default fonts on many of our systems, we have Arial, Helvetica, Times New Roman. All of those typefaces are really, really solid typefaces. They've been around for a very long time, and there's a reason for that. So it's because they are really effective. But Google Fonts, I've put that here on the screen, is also a really wonderful resource for a much larger collection of free typefaces. And the nice thing about Google Fonts is that they're already optimized for digital displays, which is usually what we're utilizing for our presentations to begin with. Over on the right-hand side, I sort of have just the main three different classifications of typefaces. Just a quick side note here, typefaces and fonts are usually utilized pretty interchangeably nowadays, but if you want to impress your friends, a typeface is a collection of fonts. So for example, Helvetica is the typeface, but a font would be like Helvetica Regular, Helvetica Light, Helvetica Bold. Those are the fonts. So if you're ever in a trivia game show and that question pops up, then you're ready to go, the difference between a typeface and a font. So up at the top, we have the serif typeface, and you can tell that it's a serif because it has this sort of bracketing at the end here. The serif typeface has been around all the way back since that Gutenberg press right at the turn of the 1500s. It has its roots within calligraphy and handwritten text. So you'll really, in addition to those little brackets that this typeface has, you can also tell by its, it typically has a narrow and wide contrasting of the letter form itself. So the left-hand slope of that A is much more narrow than the right-hand slope of that A. Very, very good in print. You'll utilize it a lot like in books. So if you're picking up a book at Prairie Lights and open it up, chances are it is going to be a serif typeface. And, you know, in terms of the connection of how you're sort of laying out your design, it has a much more formal personality, I guess. And I usually tell that to students is to think about how your type is communicating a certain personality to the audience. And so serifs are much more formal in that nature. Down below, we have the sans serif. So sans means without, so without the serif right here. Sans serifs emerged, they're more modern. So I want to say the emergence of those was in the 19th century. And then certainly in the 20th century with signage usage and all that, sans serifs are really, really popular choices because they have, if we look at that contrast in the serif where it's a thin, thick sort of combination, the sans serif has a much more unified thickness of weight. There is some slight variation going on. You can see that in the lowercase a, but overall, the thickness of the letter form themselves stays pretty consistent. And so its readability from a distance is also very, very good. It's also the preferred sort of type choice for digital displays because of that readability. So that's just one consideration to think about for yours. And then finally, we have at the bottom there is a slab serif. And that's a little bit of both. So you have a little bit of both worlds going on in that. In this particular presentation, and I hope I'm applying all these best practices to this presentation. There's a lot of pressure on me to make sure I was doing this all right. But in this particular presentation, I'm using a combination of a sans serif and a slab serif kind of throughout the whole thing. One thing that I would have tried to avoid is any sort of decorative font, okay? Any sort of overly cursive typeface that you may have available on the browser. I would sort of shy away from just because of the readability of those, especially from a distance, right? And a lot of times during this presentation, I'll be sort of reinforcing, like, what does it look like at the back of the room? And, you know, sometimes I've been in presentations that have been much more intimate in size. And so that's never really an issue. But then there's other times where it's in a large sort of convention hall and it's 50 rows back. And so who's ever sitting in the back row, are they able to read the information that's up on the screen? And so those are always considerations for everything, imagery, type, and color as we go through. So I'll sort of be reiterating upon that throughout this presentation. Font size is also very, very important, right? Again, ensuring that people in the back room can read it. Ideally, body copy, I would say that 24 is a good range. I wouldn't go much smaller than 18 points just for that readability there. So 24 is generally pretty safe. As a good rule of thumb, if we want to start to think about, right, a difference between headings and then body copy or even talking points on our slides, making sure there's enough contrast is really, really crucial. And contrast is something I'm going to bring up a lot because it's really, really important for visibility and readability. So an example here on the right, I have the I'm a header at the top and then I'm body copy down below. But you can tell, I think, from here that the variation of the size of the font is not enough, right? So here it looks like the two are sort of merged together. It actually looks like there's probably an error, that it should be the same sort of content being delivered at the top, but there's not enough differentiation. Whereas down below, the spacing is actually the same. It's just that the I'm a body copy is smaller, so it's giving us more spacing between the heading and the information down below. And so that's just an example of how we can incorporate a better use of contrast for our information, which makes it much more readable to the audience. So they don't have to work so hard to sort of parse through the information that's on the screen. And hierarchy and emphasis. Still, contrast here is very, very crucial in terms of how you're utilizing it. Hierarchy helps guide the eye. It assists with the flow of the information. And you're going to want to try to avoid too much information on one slide, right? I think that's going to be very, very important to sort of simplify our slides. I know that in my collaborations with other departments across the university, one thing that I'm always trying to press is like, can we break this out into two slides, right? When is there too much information? Are there two different thought points, right? Or maybe even three different thought points that are going on in the same slide? If that's the case, try to break that up into different slides. And that's going to make it easier to, I think, one, for the presenter to talk through the information, but two, for the viewer to actually start to understand and engage with the information that's on there. So on the right-hand side, again, now we're starting to think about how we can incorporate the different styles or weights that our typeface may have. Here, the heading is rendered in bold, stands out a little bit more. I'm also sort of switching up the our typeface choices. So I have two different typefaces. We have a little different pairings going on here. So we can think about how we can incorporate, maybe it's a sans serif serif combination and how you can bring those in different ways. Color is also a good way to promote emphasis, right? The eye sort of goes to the color too. It helps guide the eye. Italicize can also work, or if you want to underline anything, those are also strategies that you can utilize going forward. Not too long ago, actually, I heard this really interesting justification of why, in the classroom in graphic design, we definitely tend to promote that the heading is larger than the body copy, right? And that's because the user, whether they're going through a magazine or whether they're interacting with a website, they're sort of controlling the flow of information there, right? They're scrolling down the site, or they're clicking through the different links, or they're flipping through the pages. And so making sure that the eye is going to those headers is really, really important. But when I was reading this blog article about presentations, the person made an interesting argument, was that the header of a presentation is never the most important thing. It just sort of like brings up sort of what's going to be talked about on that particular slide, but yet it dominates the presence of that entire slide throughout the entire length of that slide being up on the screen. And so instead of having the heading being the largest, what if we flip that around and make the heading smaller than our body copy or our talking points? And so here's an example of that. We'll jump back one more. And this is the traditional way that we would normally think about how we lay out our presentations. I've certainly done this in the past too, where our headings are key. But if we flip it over to here, right, then all of a sudden our talking points start to jump to the front in this sort of design approach. So something to think about. We can maybe bend the rules when it comes to a presentation. That's the sort of modifying our design, being flexible with our design approaches depending on what the output is. So something to think about, maybe shrinking the size of your headers and increasing the size of your information that's down below. One caution about styling, and that's over-styling. I would encourage you to refrain from using too many italics, too many bolds, too many different instances of color on the screen, or even underlines, because it becomes more of a distraction at that point. And then it makes it really, really hard for our audience members to actually engage with the information that's being presented to them. Another consideration is consistency. So making sure that whatever you choose for your typefaces, and typically 2 to 3 different typefaces, I would say, is appropriate. Whether that's going to be a sans serif, then it's going to be a regular serif or something like that. The university here utilizes a typeface for its branding called Roboto. Roboto is found on Google Fonts. It's a really, really versatile, popular typeface because Roboto is what is called a type family. So Roboto has their sans serif, but then they've also made a condensed sans serif. So the letters are a little bit more narrow, which is kind of nice because if you have a longer heading, it fits that space a little bit more effectively. But then they also have a slab version. I think they also have a serif version too. So you have a font family that covers all of that. And so you could actually, sometimes if the font family or the typeface that you're using is very, very versatile, you can utilize just that typeface for the entire hierarchy for your presentations. But whatever you do decide to do, you want to make sure that is consistent. And so in this case, the master template built into PowerPoint is sort of key here, where you can go in and you can put in your styles, you know what you're going to do, and it's going to automatically apply that everywhere else. There's so many times I know that when I'm working in a collaborative way with others and we set up sort of a design template, go in there and set all that up. Sometimes other collaborators that get in there will change things around, and that sort of drives me nuts because then I can notice that, oh, it's still a sans serif, but it's slightly different, it has different qualities to it, and it is noticeable on the screen. And if there's any SNL fans in the room, this sort of really exaggerated example of how inconsistency can go too far. This is a skit from SNL that my kids discovered and reminded me about over the summer, about a graphic designer who just cannot sleep, cannot get over the fact that another graphic designer chose papyrus for the main logo of Avatar, sort of that hit James Cameron film of 2009. And it's true, if you look at Avatar, it looks like it is very much based off of papyrus. Papyrus is a very decorative font, so not one that I would encourage here, but this is sort of an excerpt of that particular skit. But here we can tell that we have different typefaces merged together. We have too many instances of emphasis going on. In our bullet points down here, utilizing different typefaces too, just throws everything off, makes it much more harder to read and digest the information on the screen. Spacing. Spacing is sort of the last big consideration that I would lend to you, and making sure that we're creating adequate breathing room between our groups of information. In graphic design, at the very, very beginning, we talk about Gestalt principles to design students. And one of those principles is proximity. And so when things are closer together, we tend to visually group them as a whole, that they belong together. And so you can think about how maybe a heading, an introductory paragraph text would be closer together in proximity. But when we get to our talking points, maybe there's more breathing room so we can delineate the paragraph of information from the main talking points down below. There's also letter spacing, the tracking between letters this way. I believe that PowerPoint, you can go in and make some of those modifications. Leading, which is the distance between each sentence, right? The spacing there, you can definitely go into PowerPoint and modify those as well. By default, they have like single spacing, double spacing, things like that, but you can actually go in and modify the spacing from there. In the classroom, I would typically, when you have more control in the different design applications that we utilize, I would always increase whatever the font size value is by 4 or 6 at a minimum. So if the font size is 24, then I would say that sort of line spacing, the leading, would be around 28, 30 points would be a good rule of thumb. But again, just sort of showing extreme differences here on the top, you can tell that our main heading there is really crunching up to the left-hand side of the screen, right? We want to make sure that we're maintaining some sort of margin system around the information within the slide itself, making sure there's that breathing room there. Also, the intro and main heading is really cramming together. Up at the top here, I really started to track the letters tighter together. Again, I don't think that we have too much control when it comes to PowerPoint, but that's sort of a consideration to think that if they are getting too close together, it's going to impact the readability. And then, conversely, down below the talking point, this is much more spaced out. You can see how we lose sort of the connection between those letters to form the words that we're hoping for on the screen. And then also how it's shifting over too far, right? The balance and the spacing around that is way, I would say it's probably very difficult to read from your standpoint there. And of course, down below, much more effective use of spacing. I'm trying to incorporate the same sort of spacing within this particular presentation here in terms of heading and then information that's down below. So we'll segue over into to imagery now. Humans were very much a visual group, and we do tend to process images much faster than we do text. And so there is that saying out there that, an image is worth 1,000 words. And there's some reasons for that. It's because, complex or even multiple ideas can be conveyed by just one single image. That's how effective they are. And it can do that much more effectively than, let's say, a paragraph or 2 paragraphs of text can do. Images also are able to be beneficial in enhancing retention. So I would say that, remember, images are there to enhance the effectiveness in communicating the content, and it can also bolster the overall impact of your presentation to the audience members. So some considerations for images. Relevance is really, really important. So whatever you do choose for imagery, images should be directly related to the content of the presentation. If they're not relevant images, that can be distracting to the audience, or sort of leave them wondering, I wonder what this image is all about. Like, it really has nothing to do with on the screen there. So just making sure there is that connection between the text that's on the screen and then what it is you're trying to communicate. The next one is narrative alignment, and sort of this is starting to plug into storytelling, right? So if you are thinking about utilizing storytelling within your presentation, you can think about how visuals could support that storytelling aspect of the presentation, helping to illustrate the narrative rather than just serve as a decorative element. So making sure that it's moving the information forward, and we'll talk more about storytelling in a little bit. Emotional impact, right? If this is, I want to be cognizant that there's all of us within the university are serving in different roles. We have different areas of expertise. We have different audiences that we're presenting to. And so something like an emotional impact may not be appropriate for everybody. But if you do find that this could be a potential consideration, considering the emotions that the image may evoke in the audience, right? And then the right emotional connection can enhance engagement and retention, but it should be authentic too. It should be a genuine use of emotion. So that's want to make sure I throw that out there. I talk about emotion in the classroom all the time. One particular project that we're working on now is an interactive infographic about a social justice cause for the students. And I want to make sure that if we're utilizing emotion, we're doing it in an appropriate way. But it is an important consideration that it may be relevant to what it is that you're doing for your next presentation. Quality of images. So this is really, really important. We want to make sure that we have high resolution and clear images for our audience members. If images are pixelated or blurred, it can make the presentation distracting and unprofessional. So an example of that is that if you were to have an image that you really, really want to use, but when you go and you put it into PowerPoint, it ends up being really, really small, but you want to make it bigger. But once you make that bigger, it's going to start to pixelate. And then especially when you all of a sudden enlarge the presentation on a bigger screen, it's going to do that even more. It's going to become even more noticeable. If you were going to be searching for imagery and then like sourcing it within your presentation, there is a way to look for high resolution images, like from Google. You could do that. Like the Library of Congress, the archives, they also have access to an image database, again, depending on what your content is. And then, there are free stock sources available for us. One of those is called Pexels. It's PEXELS.com. And they actually have a pretty decent repository of stock photography. But then I would just say that whenever possible, it's going to be much more impactful if you're able to take imagery of whoever the group is that you're working with. Obviously, IRB is a consideration there, but whenever you can supply your own imagery, there's going to be much more of a direct connection to what it is you're talking about. Size and scale, images and visualizations should be large enough to be easily seen from the back of the room, right? Again, thinking about who's sitting in that 50th row when they come in maybe a little bit late, in which the presentation will take place. If placing text over images, right? If you're sort of overlaying text on top of an image, we want to make sure that there's that contrast again, that there's a high enough contrast so that whatever information is there is not competing with the imagery that's in the background. So, some strategies there are considering reducing the transparency of the image, or you can even create some sort of an overlay of color and then reduce the transparency of that color. So an example of that is what I utilized on the art of typography here. The image in the background of this is not really important. It just showcases different uses of typography, but the title, art of typography, I want to make sure that that is coming forward first and foremost to the viewer, and then that image is serving as a secondary component. So this one here is utilizing the color overlay to sort of help reduce that contrast. When I talk about contrast in the classroom, there's hierarchy contrast, right? That's our information, making sure that we are delineating between headings, body copy, talking points, making sure that whatever we want to have come forward first, is sort of bigger or larger, or we're utilizing color in a certain way. But then there's also spatial hierarchy, right? And that's sort of the hierarchy like this, background, middle ground, foreground. And so that's sort of what you want to think about if you start to layer imagery and text on top of each other. Next, simplicity, right? So whatever you do choose to use for imagery, just making sure they're not overly complex or detailed, as that can become difficult for the audience to quickly understand, especially in large auditoriums. One thing that you could also think about too is iconography. There's great icon resources available. The Noun Project is just one of those. And you can bring in iconography in relation, put it in connection with your text. We do this all the time in interaction design, because those little icons there, if they're done well, they should also help serve to communicate what is being communicated within that particular slide of the presentation. I want to use this slide too, just to make a note about animations. I find that best practices are using animations sparingly and only when they add to the understanding of the concept being presented. Too many animations that are happening recurringly throughout a presentation, or if they're unnecessary informations, could just become a distraction from the content that's trying to be presented. So just something to think about there for presentations. One thing in terms of a strategy, I'll just sort of highlight that I'm trying to do in this particular series of slides is sort of the building upon these bullet points here. I actually have, I believe, 6 total. So we have one more after this. But one thing I'm trying to do to make it more simplified and actually not have to use some sort of an animation, but it sort of gives that effect of an animation, is as I slide forward, right, this list just starts to build, and then what was ever preceding it reduces to some sort of a neutral grayed out color, and it helps the eye flow there. So this is another strategy that maybe you would find useful in the future, is just sort of, maybe you can build out your list. You don't have to have everything displayed all at once. here's an example. You can imagine that if this list were just on one slide, and if I just started talking about all 6 of these different consideration items here, may be harder to follow through. Whereas if we can just start to build upon one after the other, and then you can always leave everything else that came before it there so that we can always reference back to it as the viewer, could just be an effective strategy. Last thing I just want to talk about are cultural considerations, right? And that's just being mindful of cultural differences and the potential for images to be interpreted differently by people from various backgrounds. My time in the government really helped hone that mindset for myself, because we were trying to create materials for just various different groups of people across the country. All right, we'll segue into color now. Color is very, very important. Not sure, we all maybe have different degrees of comfort with color. Sometimes it may be intimidating to work with color because there's so many different color options available to us. So I want to kind of break this down. One, we'll talk about sort of the psychology of color, and that is that colors do evoke emotions. So that, we interpret colors in different ways, and it could spark different emotions within us. And then we'll also talk briefly about sort of color theory and relationships from there. So just thinking about maybe how psychology can play a role within your presentations, or maybe as a starting point from there. So for example, if you're doing a presentation that has to do with sustainability or the environment, green is definitely one of the top choices that maybe comes to mind, that starts as your primary color from there. In my time in the government, everything was blue. We had to try to fight against that all the time, because blue sort of has this built-in thought that it conveys trust and dependability, and that's certainly what the government wanted to have in its materials. And so that may be a starting point of thinking about blue. Red sort of it's a passion color. It's a high energy color. It's used for maybe important warnings or for call to actions. Then we have orange, enthusiasm, creativity, warmth, could be inviting interactions, casual or informal presentations. Yellow may have more of a creative content, or I see it a lot with educational type materials are utilizing yellow. And then purple, innovative topics, discussions of, future visions, has royalty, wisdom, luxury sort of assigned to it as the color. And then, we have black is also a color that we can utilize. And black has the sort of formal and sophistication feel that's behind it. Obviously, there's white, right? More simplicity, minimalism is utilized for that. And then there's also brown, right? You think about earthiness, stability, and reliability sort of coming from the different brown tones from there. Now, that to be said, these emotions that are sort of just put up here on the screen right now are not set in stone, right? These are not, everybody interprets color differently on an emotional level, but this is just sort of a starting point to get you to think about how you can utilize color with your own presentations. And is there a good connection point or emotional connection point of justification for the color or colors that you decide to use? So let's jump into the color theory. Just the basics. Again, there's a lot more going on in color theory than what I'll be talking about, but this will just be sort of scratching at the surface of it and just give you enough of the basic principles and understandings of how you can start to utilize color in the future. It's a little bit art and a little bit science coming together. So we have Isaac Newton in the 1600s develops the color wheel. And then all of a sudden we have these different color relationships that start to emerge. From these interactions, harmony and color relationships come to the forefront, and then harmonious colors can be aesthetically pleasing, and they can help to maintain focus. So the different sort of, before we get into the color relationships, the color wheel itself is broken down. If we were to slice it in half, we have warm tones on one side. Thinking about warm tones, how they tend to push forward to the viewer. And then on the other side, we have our cool colors. Those tend to recede more. We always have artists and designers that are trying to break that sort of rule, and you can. But as a good rule of thumb, warm tends to come forward. and cool tends to recede. We also have different saturation levels. So if you think about on the left-hand side here, it's sort of the brightness, it's the intensity of the color, right? So the higher the saturation, the higher the intensity. Also, the higher the saturation, the more the eye goes to it, right? Whereas on the right-hand side, we have much more desaturated colors. Those are muted, and again, those tend to recede. So brighter colors will come out at us, and more desaturated colors will tend to recede towards the background. One thing to notice too, and I'll utilize sort of the left-hand side model there, is that on the very, very edge of the color wheel that's happening now, the color is much more darker, right? And as we go towards the center, there's various tints that get us closer to a lighter center there. The reason why that's happening is because on the screen, we utilize RGB as the color mode. So here's another, I guess, trivia quiz item for you all that you can take away. In the print world, we utilize CMYK, cyan, yellow, magenta, and black, those four colors. And from those four colors, we mix them together to make all these other colors that are available to us. But when you mix all those colors together, right, it becomes darker and darker and darker the more colors that you mix, right? So that's subtractive light that's happening there. Whereas on the screen, we utilize RGB, so red, blue, green, and those are going to be more additive colors. So when you bring those together, they actually create white. So it's a little bit of a flip there. So CMYK, colors mixing become darker in the print world. On the screen, RGB, colors coming together make white. So that's pretty cool, the difference that's going on there. So now we have our different relationships here, right? So some of these may be familiar, you may have heard about these in the past. I'll just go through them relatively briefly here, but just to make sure everybody's sort of on the same page. So the first one is complementary, and those are colors that are opposite of each other on the color wheel. So in this example here, we have blue on one side, and then we have orange on the other side being its complement, okay? The next one over is monochromatic, and that's just choosing one color and then working with various tints or shades of that color to create a unified color scheme from there. So just one single color and then finding different variations of it. The next one over is analogous, and that is choosing, right, that's like three colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So in this example here, there's a lot of different variations of color, but it would be blue, green, and yellow, for example, right? Those are analogous colors. Or red, orange, and yellow would also be another analogous color pairing that you could work with. Then we have a few more. We have triadic. So this particular PowerPoint that I designed, I'm utilizing more of a triadic color scheme. So I'm using blue, red, and orange. In this example here, if we think about triadic, they're evenly spaced on the color wheel. So it's three colors, but they're evenly spaced between each other on the color wheel. That's how you get sort of a triadic grouping of colors. The next one over is called the split complementary. It's also three colors, but in this case here, you would choose one primary color. Here it's purple. Its complement would be yellow, but then instead of choosing yellow, you choose the two colors on either side of that complementary color. So we get this sort of green and more of a orangey color that's on the opposite sides of there. So that's sort of the split complementary. And then finally, we have tetradic, right? That's using four colors. Again, they're going to be equally spaced and they are complementary on the color wheel. So that purple and more reddish color, there's one step in between those. Down below, we have that sort of lime green, a bit more of a darker orange, and then one step is yellow, but then on the sides, there's three steps that are occurring on the sides. So just to recap, all six: complementary, monochromatic, analogous, triadic, split complementary, and tetradic. All right. So going back to contrast, right? We want to make sure that we're aiming for high contrast on the screen just for readability's sake. We want to avoid colors that are too dark, too light, too bright, or even too similar. Either of those are going to make it much more difficult to read. So making sure that if it's going to be dark text on a light background, or vice versa, light text on a dark background. We just want to make sure that there's enough contrast for the viewer, especially those all the way in the back. And so here's two examples, right? The top one is utilizing a much more lighter color for my color scheme for this presentation, paired with black text on top, and then flipping it, I have that darker blue that I'm utilizing, and then utilizing a lighter color of type on there. But just looking at contrast here. Now let's take a look at some poor examples. And I'm sorry for the bottom one. That bottom one, I just look at it now and it's like giving me a headache. But in the top example, we have colors that are too similar, right? They're both relatively dark colors. They're too similar, and there's just not enough contrast that's going on there. Tonally, they're very, very similar. That's just not going to push through on the screen. It may be fine right now for us reading it, but definitely, you know, from a distance, you're not going to see that. And then down below, the one that, you know, is pain inducing is an example of when you have two really high saturated colors that are fighting each other, right? And there's sort of this frequency that's going on. When this happens, that's a good indicator that you want to make one of those colors darker or lighter in tone, okay? Either way. But when they're both on the same sort of saturation level, they're gonna battle it out, and it won't be pretty. You can also think about how you can start to mix up your color schemes together, right? In terms of a hierarchy standard or standpoint. So heading, if we look at this example right here, because of that darker background, sort of the white color is going to have the highest contrast. It's going to jump out the most. I put the intro copy into sort of this lighter blue, so that has more of a muted effect going down. And then I'm utilizing a warmer color. Again, warmer when paired with the cooler colors tend to jump out at us further. So I'm utilizing that warmer color to start to push out at us for the main talking points in this particular example here. One thing that I do for students is I have them sort of create a square that acts as the primary color, and then bring in as smaller squares what the other colors are that they're thinking about utilizing. And I think that's just a really good exercise. And maybe something that's beneficial for you too, as you're starting to develop your sort of design system for your presentations, is sort of just to take your colors and you can start to stack them one on top of each other just to see how they start to interact, right? And I'm just, when I look at this right now, I'm just looking at, again, contrast and harmony of color together, right? And this is a good exercise where you should start to easily identify. They should start to jump out at you, ones that are not working, and you can make the calibration adjustments as needed from there. Okay, and as you do it more and more, you just become more and more effective at working with color in the future. Now, there are plenty of resources out there. Canva is just one. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Canva. I know it's become more and more popular over the last few years. It's just a wonderful resource for people that maybe don't have a design background to have access or knowledge to good design practices. So I see that's a really, really valuable toolkit that's available out there. You know, a lot of content out there is free that you can read through. They do have different color pickers that you can utilize that can help you get started with, you know, developing color schemes. Just jumping to Canva real quick, it's also a great resource. You can utilize it for data visualizations, and you can customize those data visualizations from the colors that you are going to choose and work with. If you were to go with the subscription route, I think they also have access to other things too. They may have access to imagery. I'm not entirely sure on that. But in addition to color, we should also think about neutral. So I always have students come up with a range of neutral colors that can be utilized in connection with those primary colors, and they just serve as sort of more neutral backgrounds, and they let your colors sort of take more center stage as they're going forward. One more exercise that I do for my students is sort of come up with this color track scheme in terms of how they're going to utilize color. And you can break this down in any sort of percentage that you want to. But in this one particular example here, right, that darker blue, we're going to utilize that as the main primary color. The lighter blue will be utilized as more of a secondary color. And then those two warm colors are going to be pops of color that can be used for emphasis throughout the presentation. So something like this too may just help sort of clarify how you want to approach color, and then how you want to utilize it consistently. One other final tip is just sort of accessibility, making sure that whatever colors that you do decide to work with has that contrast. So the WebAIM color contrast checker is a great resource to make sure those colors are working effectively. And then also thinking about, color universal design, CUD. There's tons of sites that are connected to this, but this is ideally for viewers that may have some sort of visual impairments. If we want to think about it for our audience members, like color blindness, for example, how are we working with color, and are those colors going to be effective? Because sometimes you may have two color combinations, but for those individuals, they don't see the distinction between those two colors. And then whatever you're trying to use for emphasis or hierarchy, is not going to be very effective. So thinking about accessibility is always a great practice. Sort of moving on, storytelling, right? I personally I'm not trying to say that I'm an author or, I write stories, but more so how we can leverage storytelling techniques. So design, right? As a goal, we seek to put information into somebody else's mind, right? If that's informing them about a topic, or, they utilize design to get you to buy Tide, whatever it is, right? You're trying to implant that into somebody else's mind to get them to think about it, or, do some sort of an action. Stories also function that way too, right? We bring this information into other people when we're reading through stories, right? Or somebody's telling us a story. That's working on the same sort of wavelength. And then certainly when we're giving presentations, that's exactly what we're trying to do too. So I'm just trying to make a connection point between how, storytelling, it's sort of objectives, right? Are also sort of similar to design and to presentations as well. So stories captivate us, right? They facilitate both emotional connection and cognitive engagement, but they do need to be authentic and relevant, right? And they shouldn't be forced. I sort of made that point early on when we were talking about it, I believe, back with image considerations. Relatability enhances retention. So if audience members see themselves in a story, they're more likely to remember its message. So sometimes you may be able to utilize a story that's pertaining to a certain research project. You can bring that into the presentation. If it's acceptable, you could always have a case study from that research project, and you could record somebody, and part of the slide could be them telling their story to the audience member too, right? That can become very, very impactful. Or you can even think about how stories are structured, right? Stories have a beginning, middle, and end, right? And so creating some sort of a slide arc where you establish context in the beginning, you delve into the content in the middle, and then so you sort of think about how you're going to finish with a compelling conclusion at the end. So that's a sort of touching upon storytelling and maybe how you can start to weave that into your future presentations if it's relevant. Just want to, almost at the end here, just want to go through some just practical tips and sort of summarize everything that we went through. So making sure that we're maintaining consistency with use of color, making sure we're maintaining consistency with our use of type, keeping our slide design simple, not overly, complex with imagery or with information that's being presented, making sure that the type and image, they do play a really crucial role in your presentations and the engagement that it has with the audience members. So it does matter, and it is important to give it some consideration and thought at the very beginning. Contrast is sort of the name of the game here. Contrast with our hierarchy, contrast with our colors, all that is so important. Spatial contrast too, that sort of idea is really, really important, is contrast. Thinking about the 6-6 rule, and this sort of idea goes back to keeping our slide design simple. The 6-6 rule is sort of 6 bullet points, and each bullet point only having sort of 6 words for it. So really trying to think about how we can make our messaging as concise as possible, because we always have our notes, right? We can always utilize our notes to expand upon those initial ideas. But if we want to really think about keeping those the information to a minimum on the screen, this is just one rule that you can utilize. And then separate ideas, right? Again, we don't want to have multiple ideas up on the screen. We can space that out over different slides just to help with the retention and the readability and the comprehension for our audience members. And just some additional resources here at the end, Slideology from Nancy Durtet, Presentations Zen, Gar Reynolds. This is a great, just a website about all things presentations. And he really goes into a lot of storytelling techniques within that site. So definitely worth checking it out. The Non-Designer's Design Books is a great resource of how we can utilize design practices to the best of our abilities, even though we don't have necessarily a background in design. And then finally, right, Canvas Design School. There's a lot of free, great information out there about the basics of design principles as well. So thank you so much for your time. I hope I left us enough time for some Q&A at the end here, but yes, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was great. So we do have time for a couple questions if you'd like to put them in the chat, or if you'd also just like to raise your hand and unmute yourself.
I really, really appreciated that. It's very interesting. I'm wondering, for those of us who are novices, if we wanted to use the color theory, are there ways within something as formulaic as PowerPoint to create different color schemes, or is that more a matter of just being more attentive when you use their color schemes, what you're communicating?
Yeah, so PowerPoint automatically does have some color combinations that are going on inside of it. They're a great starting point. But I do know that on the web, there's many different resources to really customize color too. I feel like the tools that are available in PowerPoint are maybe just more limited. And I'm thinking about it for myself. Again, somebody that works with color a lot, I definitely want to have much more customized control. And so if the comfort level, for you all is sort of lower, right? Not really hesitant about color. PowerPoint, what they sort of offer as those kind of default color schemes in there is a great starting point. Just start with it, work with it. As you get more and more comfortable, or maybe more adventurous, you can certainly go out. Like I said, the Canva has a great color palette resource available to you that you can go in and just start with one color, and then from there branch it out, complementary, analogous, whatever it is you want to do, and it starts to give you recommendations from there.
Thank you.
Jenna had also sent me, I'll drop it in the chat, a color palette kind of maker that you can use.
Oh, perfect. There's a lot. I know Adobe has one too that's free. There's so many out there that you can utilize.
Mm-hmm. Right.
This exists when I was a student. I wish it had. We had to do things the old-fashioned way with Pantone swatch books. So
yeah. Another thing that I like to do is even just Googling kind of color palettes. That's a way to do it. I've done that before.
Absolutely. Yeah, anything that's just going to get you starting to think about it, I would say do it. Even with use of type, if working with fonts is again intimidating. Like I said, you can start with one font that has just enough variation in terms of its use of bold or italic. Sometimes there's even a light variation of it that gets that can be utilized as well. Just start with one and just see what you can do from a hierarchy standpoint, and then as you get more and more comfortable with it, you can start to pair that with another typeface that's working well too.
Mm-hmm. One thing I was curious about is kind of the preloaded PowerPoint templates that you can often choose what your thoughts were about using that, or if maybe someone should try to get away from those since we see them so often. But I was just curious what you thought about those.
Yeah, they're just a bit generic, right? And so I would say that I think there's also a lot of, maybe it's too much emphasis on sort of this design shell that's going on within some of those templates. So I guess a couple of thoughts. One is they tend to be more generic. And if you're trying to find some sort of a color scheme or design motif that fits what it is you're talking about, you're probably not going to find it in sort of the built-in presets of PowerPoint. And then if you looked at my slide deck, I wasn't using a lot of really swooshes or angular elements throughout there because they can be distracting too, right? It sort of pulls focus for the for the audience member. Whereas I think the content that you choose to put on the screen, and then whatever image you choose to utilize to help bolster that content, that should really be priority number one. And sometimes those design elements tend to get in the way. So those are my thoughts on those presets that are in there.
Well, thank you.
But
Any other audience questions?
and I'm happy to send you all a PDF copy of this if you want to use it as a resource. Feel free. I'll definitely send it to you after this Zoom call.
Yeah, that would be awesome. We archive all of our Get It Done workshops on our YouTube channel. So this will be up on our YouTube in about 2 weeks, hopefully, more or less. And then we can put your PDF also, if you're okay with that, on the resource page.
Perfect. That'd be great.
Okay. And I think, okay, we have an audience comment saying, I've learned a lot, though my head is swimming a bit. I need to play with this. So I think you gave us a lot to think about.
Yeah, I know it was a brain dump, for sure. So, yeah, hopefully just let it sit there, and hopefully you get a little bit inspired to start mixing things up in the future as we go forward.
Yeah, it definitely makes me feel a little bit more confident to try out some other things and break out of those templates that they give you. All right. Well,
Wonderful.
Yeah, if we don't have any other questions, then thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for doing this. This was awesome. And we look forward to seeing you again at another Get It Done.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.